about the theological insights of theistic evolution and young earth creationism. The reason I wanted to talk on this topic is because I find these very interesting. It's relevant to what I'm currently studying, which is philosophy of biology. And I also think that there are ways that theistic evolutionists and young earth creationists don't get on with each other. One side seems to think that the other doesn't have a brain, and the other side seems to think that the first doesn't have like a heart for God or for Scripture. And I think those stereotypes aren't always helpful because it can undermine unity between Christians. And so I wanted to offer two insights that I think each position has, and to show how we can appreciate the other side more and their insight into God. The other reason I'm doing this is because it's commonly believed that if you believe the universe is a young age, then that doesn't make a difference on your view of God. And if you believe it's a really old age, that doesn't make a difference on your view of God. And I kind of want to not dispel that, but show that it's a bit more nuanced than that, that actually there are certain emphases on the nature of God that you might find yourself having if you belong to one camp versus belonging to another. And those aren't unhelpful emphases, and they can actually be appreciated by people who might disagree with you on what you believe the age of the universe is. And so I'll kind of describe how both of those things are true for for theistic evolution and for young earth creationism. So theistic evolutionists have a really wonderful theological insight in that they understand the mystery and the unknowability of certain aspects of creation. Just to clarify, theistic evolution believes that the universe is about 13 or so billion years old, and believes the contemporary account of how all life came to be, namely that arrived by evolution and natural selection. And they believe, therefore, that God directed evolution because they still believe God played a role, but it was more of a kind of sustaining things as they went along role, and that he had a plan, an end goal that humans ultimately should emerge, and that was his plan for history. So that's the theistic evolution view. And the reason I say they emphasize the unknowability of the past is because it's obviously a very deep past, there's very deep time, and they would basically object that, you're being too literal, you're saying that the Bible is a science book, that you can't know these details of the past to the degree of certainty that you seem to claim you can. And I think what's useful about this insight is that it does have a lot of biblical warrant. So when you look at the book of Job, you find that God asks Job at the end of that book, were you there when I laid the foundations of the earth? Were you there when, that lion took its prey or whatever? And two notable insights, I think, that I found actually quite interesting and helpful is that God literally points to creatures that are very powerful and seem armed as though they are ready to be, combating humans or other creatures. And one of the biggest example of this is Leviathan. God literally draws attention to Leviathan's phenotypes, which is just a fancy word for observable biological trait. He draws attention to his scales, to the fact that, he can breathe fire or whatever it is, that can cause him to be a formidable foe. And God says, look, this creature is designed in this way, and he's king over all the sons of pride, and ultimately I'm the one responsible for this, and you might not be able to understand all the reasons why this incredibly powerful creature exists. And similarly, and perhaps more so, I know that God rather emphasizes that Job is not as powerful as Leviathan, rather than not knowing why Leviathan has come to be, though I'm sure that's one of the undertones. And the reason I say that's an undertone is because God makes a similar point just with ostriches. He looks at the ostrich, he says, do you know why the ostrich is here? Look at the ostrich. It just looks at her young berries, like her eggs are just there, and then it just kind of runs away and doesn't even care about her young, and it acts in vain. And again, a lot of my evolutionary biology teachers would point out that there are lots of vain things that happen in life, and we don't really know why they're there. In fact, some of them would go as far as to say, like, "Oh, it's dumb." That you can see how evolution is blind and life is pointless because you have one animal that just eats another animal in a rock paper scissors like arrangement, whatever it is. They'll just point to something that looks vain and say, "Yeah, that's really dumb." But God literally looks at the ostrich and he says, "Look, the Lord has not provided this creature with wisdom. Do you understand its ways?" And God literally points to how perplexing some of these things are and says and emphasizes that Job, sarcastically says, "Where were you?" The implication is Job wasn't there, that he can't know why all of these things are the way they are. And I think that's actually a really helpful emphasis to have. It's a very useful emphasis because sometimes we can be so obsessed with clarifying the origins of life that we don't have a healthy dose of humility. And I think young Earth creationists can take note from that and basically say, "Yep, that's true. We can't know why everything is the way it is," and so that's actually an insight that I think both can share, even though I think one camp, theistic evolutionists, tend to emphasize that insight more. In fact, there is another insight that they have, which is, and when I say they, I'm going to say they in both camps to not indicate which camp I'm a part of. That's why I'm just saying they. Even though, obviously, I do have an opinion on these things, but I'm not going to be sharing that in this video. But the other insight that theistic evolutionists have is that they understand that there's a bit of nuance to what it means for creation to be good. So theistic evolution would believe that animal death existed before the fall, and some people find that to be quite problematic because Romans 5 seems to emphasize that death comes after the fall. Now, some would say, well, no, that's death of a spiritual kind, and that's with respect to humans' relationship to God. Whereas others would say, no, that includes all forms of death, including animal death. And at least what a theistic evolutionist will do is ask the question, well, can the fact that creation was declared to be good at its pinnacle include the fact that parts of creation involved perishability and some form of decay? I'm going to blow my nose, so I'm going to just cut back to this. Right, glad that you didn't see that because I've cut through. But yeah, they emphasize that maybe goodness and perishability are not at odds with each other. And I know that there are many young Earth creationists who are tempted to think that that can't be true, surely. But again, the reason that this is a useful insight is because there is some theological basis to it. If you just consider, if you're even if you take the Genesis account very literally, and you do believe that there were trees in the garden, literal trees or whatever, and you believe that God gave them to Adam and Eve for food and all the rest of it, you do have to say, even if you don't agree to, if you're a young Earth creationist and don't agree to the extent that a theistic evolutionist emphasizes that there was just death in the animal kingdom everywhere prior to the arrival of Adam and Eve, you still have to concede that there are things which did decay. So if Adam and Eve ate the fruit of the trees, you have to admit those fruit were digested. And digestion is a taking of energy and breaking it down. That plant matter had to be broken down. Unless you're going to say that Adam and Eve just somehow ate the fruit and the fruit remained intact, which seems like a very silly position to have. And certainly it doesn't seem to be the case with the resurrected body of Christ. I mean, he literally just eats fish in front of his disciples. And if his resurrected body is breaking things down like fish, how much more then would Adam's and Eve's normal body, which is similar, hopefully, I think, to our body, break things down in a normal process of digestion? And so it's not wrong for there to be things that get broken down, not inherently. Obviously, one might want to draw a line and say, well, what happens if something that's conscious then ends up dying? And there can be debate there, but at the very least, a young Earth creationist can appreciate the insight that a bit more nuance might be needed when we just blanket call something good. We need to understand that goodness can actually involve a kind of harmony where you are breaking things down, but in a good way. You're benefiting from the fruit of the tree. The tree, its fruit is, in a sense, God says he gives the fruit for the humans. The purpose of the fruit is for the humans to consume. So yeah, I think a bit of nuance there is something that theistic evolutionists offer, and young Earth creationists would do well to pay attention to that. On the other side, for young Earth creationists, they also have some very useful theological insights about the nature of God, and this is where I think it does actually make a difference whether you think the Earth is old or young, and just in how you emphasize God's power. And what I mean by this is that a young Earth creationist believes God performed a grade A miracle when he created all of the heavens and the earth, that when he said, let there be stars, in the moment, in fact, it just says, and the stars in Genesis 1, in that moment, stars just were there. It wasn't a process of matter coalescing over billions and billions of years, but rather it was just God said something and it was so. And it was so in that moment, on the very, in a young Earth creationist view, on the very 24-hour period in which God said it. And that is colossal power. And I'm not saying that a theistic evolutionist can't appreciate that power, but a young Earth creationist believes that God did, in fact, use that power in the past to create the universe, and that it is therefore easier for God, as it were, to set the parameters of the universe and to create the universe than it is for a programmer to set the parameters of a physics simulation or of a video game. God could literally just say, I'm going to get light, I'm going to diffuse it throughout the whole universe, and, or like, spread it, not diffuse it, but spread it throughout the whole universe, and then I'm going to put a speed limit on it and then just click run afterwards. And I think the benefit of this view is that it helps us really appreciate that God is not limited by the laws of nature. In fact, since he created the laws of nature, we should not say that he is violating those laws if he's in the process of establishing them. What I mean is this, is that people tend to think, oh, well, God, like someone would object, well, God couldn't have created a universe in 6 days because we know it takes light so many billions of years to reach Earth, and therefore the universe has to be that many billions of years old. And I guess what I'm saying is that that may well be true, but the assumption of that is that the speed of light had to be what it is today as God was actually establishing it in the first place. And that's not true any more than it's true that a programmer, in establishing the speed of light in a physics engine, is constrained to conform to that speed in the process of, like, creating that physics engine. That programmer could just as easily say, right, I want the light to be everywhere instantly, and then I'll put a speed limit on it. And that's very easy for the programmer, yet for some reason we have a disconnect and we don't think it would be even easier for God to do the same thing. And I think that's a very helpful insight, that, yeah, we need to be careful that we're not limiting God's power in how we're assuming things came to be. And that's I think, a very useful insight. Now, the reason a theistic evolutionist can still appreciate this insight of young Earth creationism is that both will believe, almost certainly if they're Christians, that Jesus will return, and that at the end of time, if they take seriously accounts in Revelation and accounts in, I think, 2 Peter, of how Jesus will return, that it will be a sudden return, that we will see the heavenly powers be shaken in some way, that we'll see the sky. The poetic way of describing it is that the sky is going to be rolled back like a scroll. Obviously, you can see it's poetic because it's like a scroll. It's like, it's a simile. It's not that it's literally a scroll or anything, but it will be a sudden end to the present way that heaven and earth work as we know it, and we know that will happen, and it will be seen from Earth very suddenly. And that means that at the end of the day, you're going to believe in a God who who does end things suddenly, who does create suddenly. He can bring things to an end suddenly, and that can be viewable. And I, you can think like, how on earth can we see the heavens end suddenly when it takes light billions and billions of years to travel from one side of the universe to the other? Does God just like end end the universe progressively, and he just waits for the light to get to Earth until we can see it at once? Or is he just going to be like, nah, I'm going to show you what it is now, and he's just going to make sure that you can actually see what's going on from one end of heaven to the other? And maybe, I don't know, but maybe that would be a part of what it would mean when the passage says the powers of the heavens will be shaken, like the way that things have worked up till now. Just suddenly it's no longer working that way, and that would be a terrifying thing to see. And I'm not saying like, I know any of how God's actually going to do it. I'm not, and therefore don't take this to be like, yes, it will happen this way. But all of that to say is that a theistic evolutionist will probably concede that God really will manifest the degree of power that seems to be emphasized by a young Earth creationist in how he created the universe. That at the end of time, both positions will agree that God will manifest colossal power, even more power than someone would believe if God created the universe in 6 literal days. And so I think both sides can actually appreciate that insight into God's power, even if a young Earth creationist might have a tendency to emphasize that side of things a bit more, or at least believe that God really did manifest those things early on in ways that a theistic evolutionist might not believe he manifested, a sudden creation of things. So I think related to that, I think there is an emphasis on the wisdom of God, namely that you think of a narrative that says God basically established a set of laws, and then in establishing those laws at the beginning of time, he then let the Big Bang happen, whatever it is, and he just kind of let those laws unfold, and he knew that they would lead into human civilization. It would lead into a setting in which he could actually manifest his salvation. But also, it's interesting to contrast that with a narrative that says, actually, instead of God's just taking, as it were, just a small set of laws and then just kind of sustaining the universe as it unfolded, he suddenly created everything in its place. And I think and that's the young Earth creationist position. And I think the reason that has more of an insight into God's wisdom is because it shows that, man, the kind of knowledge required to just know what laws will work and then just kind of make sure they unfold properly. And I'm not saying all theistic evolutionists believe this. I know that they believe that he does intervene in some way, but even if you grant that, the knowledge required to just kind of like guide things along with the right initial conditions is very different from knowing every single cell, every single atom, every single molecule in a fully mature universe, and knowing what place it has to be in at what time, and just the immense wisdom of just creating these extremely intricate dynamic systems immediately, or at least in a ridiculously short space of time, literally as you just speak it into existence. He knew the details of every plant, every animal, every creature, every star, every planet, every single thing in the moment he created them. And that kind of knowledge is far deeper than a knowledge that of some initial conditions that will unfold correctly. And again, I think that a theistic evolutionist can appreciate that insight, because the Book of Job emphasizes that God really is aware of all of these details. And so both young Earth creationists and theistic evolutionists can appreciate that insight. But nevertheless, it's a helpful insight, and it's a helpful emphasis that you may find more in one camp than the other, but which both camps can appreciate. So that's this video. I hope it was helpful. And yeah, sorry that the equipment isn't set up. I'm actually moving house. So it's not as fancy a video as normal. The audio won't be as good, but hope you enjoyed, and see you guys soon. well, I won't see you because I'm just talking to this silly lens here. But I hope you have a good day. Bye. See you.